"You're not marriage material like he is. He actually wants commitment," she said while I had the ring in my pocket. So I returned the ring and moved out without a word. Now he used her to get promoted, then dumped and fired her, and she's watching me build the life she thought she deserved. I'd been with Whitney for 8 months when I started noticing the changes. It began subtly at first, just slightly longer eye contact with bartenders and servers, but by the time we attended our friend Jake's rooftop barbecue in downtown Portland last Saturday night, her behavior had become impossible to ignore and frankly embarrassing. I watched from across the deck as Whitney spent nearly 2 hours positioned next to Marcus, some marketing consultant she just met that evening, touching his arm every time she laughed at his jokes and leaning in close enough that her hair brushed his shoulder when she whispered something in his ear. She'd positioned herself so she was facing him directly with her back partially turned to the rest of the party, creating an intimate bubble that excluded everyone else including me. The way she tilted her head back when she laughed, the way her fingers lingered on his forearm when making a point, the way she seemed to forget I existed despite standing just 15 feet away with our mutual friends who were growing increasingly uncomfortable watching the display unfold. What made it worse was how deliberate it all seemed, like she was performing for an audience, occasionally glancing around to make sure people were noticing her charm and desirability. She'd touch her neck while talking, play with her hair, and mirror his body language in ways that seemed calculated rather than natural. I tried to catch her eye several times throughout the evening, but she was completely absorbed in whatever conversation they were having about craft breweries and weekend hiking spots, topics I knew she had zero interest in normally but was suddenly passionate about discussing with expert knowledge she'd somehow acquired. When I finally walked over and suggested we grab some food from the catering table, she barely glanced at me before telling Marcus she'd be right back, like I was interrupting something important rather than trying to reconnect with my own girlfriend at a social event. The drive home was tense and silent until I finally brought up what had happened, explaining how her behavior had made me and our friends uncomfortable and asking if she understood how it looked when she spent an entire evening focused on another man while essentially ignoring me. Whitney's response was immediate and dismissive, rolling her eyes and telling me I was being possessive and controlling, that she's just naturally flirty and social and that's part of her personality I fell for in the first place. She insisted it was completely harmless because she wasn't actually doing anything wrong, just being friendly and charming, and that I should trust her intentions rather than policing her conversations with other people. When I mentioned that Sarah and Jake had both pulled me aside separately to ask if everything was okay between us because they'd noticed her behavior at previous gatherings, Whitney became defensive and angry, turning the entire conversation around on me and accusing me of trying to control her personality and change who she fundamentally was as a person. She claimed I was being insecure and jealous, that real confident men don't get threatened by their girlfriends being social and engaging with others, and that maybe I needed to examine why I felt so intimidated by her natural charisma and ability to connect with people. The argument escalated when I pointed out that there's a difference between being social and what I'd witnessed, that flirting involves specific behaviors and body language that go beyond just being friendly, but she dismissed everything I said as paranoid overthinking. By the time we reached her apartment, Whitney had worked herself into a full rage, telling me she needed space to think about whether she wanted to be with someone who would try to dim her light and restrict her social interactions based on his own insecurities. She grabbed an overnight bag with dramatic flair, throwing clothes and toiletries into it while muttering about how she couldn't believe I was trying to control her after only 8 months together, and announced she was staying with her sister Melody for the night because she couldn't handle being around my negative energy and baseless accusations right now. She slammed the door behind her, leaving me standing in her hallway wondering if I was actually overreacting to normal social behavior or if my instincts about her increasingly bold and disrespectful flirtation were completely justified, and questioning whether our relationship had any real foundation if this was how she responded to legitimate concerns about her behavior. 3 days passed without a word from Whitney, and I'd almost started to think our relationship might actually be over when she showed up Tuesday morning with coffee and pastries like nothing had happened. She breezed into my apartment wearing the same bright smile she'd flashed at Marcus, acting as if our entire argument about her inappropriate flirting had been some minor misunderstanding that time had magically resolved. She chatted casually about work and weekend plans, completely avoiding any mention of the barbecue incident or her dramatic exit, until she mentioned that Melody's 26th birthday party was coming up this Saturday at some upscale wine bar in downtown Portland called Elevation. When I asked what time I should be ready, Whitney's expression shifted slightly and she explained that Melody had specifically requested no plus ones for this particular celebration because she wanted to keep it small and intimate, just immediate family and her closest friends from college. Something about the way she said it felt off, too rehearsed and casual, especially since I'd met Melody several times before and we'd always gotten along well, so I couldn't understand why she would suddenly exclude me from a family gathering. I'd been to other family events with Whitney over the past 8 months, including Melody's housewarming party just 3 months ago where she'd specifically told me how glad she was that Whitney had found someone stable and genuine. After Whitney left for work, I found myself replaying our conversation and remembering how Melody had always seemed curious about our relationship, asking thoughtful questions about my job and interests like she was genuinely trying to get to know me as a person rather than just Whitney's temporary boyfriend. The no plus ones excuse struck me as particularly strange because Melody had been in a serious relationship with her boyfriend David for over 2 years, and it seemed unlikely she would exclude him from her own birthday celebration. Something was definitely not adding up, so I decided to reach out to Melody directly through Instagram to clarify the situation, sending her a casual message congratulating her on her upcoming birthday and mentioning that I was disappointed I couldn't attend due to the no plus ones policy. Her response came within an hour and completely shattered Whitney's story, with Melody expressing confusion about the no plus ones rule and explaining that she'd actually encouraged everyone to bring their significant others. She seemed genuinely surprised to learn that Whitney had a serious boyfriend, mentioning that Whitney had never brought up being in a relationship during their recent conversations and that she'd been under the impression her sister was still single and casually dating. Melody went on to explain that she'd actually been curious about Whitney's mysterious boyfriend that their mom had mentioned in passing, and she enthusiastically invited me to attend as her own plus one since she'd been wanting to meet the guy who had managed to capture her notoriously picky sister's attention for more than a few months. The revelation that Whitney had been deliberately excluding me from family events while maintaining some fiction about our relationship status hit me like a physical blow, making me realize that her flirtation problem was likely just the tip of a much larger iceberg of deception I'd been too naive to recognize. I spent the rest of the afternoon analyzing every family gathering we'd attended together, suddenly understanding why Whitney always seemed nervous at those events and why she always insisted we leave early with work excuses. The pattern was becoming crystal clear, and I felt sick thinking about how many lies she must have told to maintain this deception for 8 months. Melody's enthusiasm about finally meeting me was both heartwarming and heartbreaking, revealing that Whitney's family had been genuinely curious about her mysterious boyfriend while Whitney had been actively working to keep us separated. I agreed to attend the party as Melody's plus one, and we spent the next hour texting as she filled me in on family dynamics and expressed her excitement about getting to know the person who had apparently made such a positive impact on Whitney's life. By the time our conversation ended, I realized that Saturday night's birthday party was going to be a moment of truth that would finally reveal Whitney's deception and force her to confront the lies she'd been telling. Over the next few days, Melody and I exchanged dozens of text messages as we coordinated our plan, and she filled me in on details that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of Whitney's deceptive behavior patterns spanning much longer than our 8-month relationship. What started as simple party planning conversations quickly evolved into a full investigation as Melody began sharing information that revealed the true extent of Whitney's lies and manipulation tactics that she'd apparently been perfecting for years. She told me that Whitney had been actively telling family members she was single and actively seeking someone who met her impossibly high standards, even going so far as to ask their Aunt Linda for introductions to eligible bachelors at recent family gatherings while simultaneously maintaining a serious relationship with me. Melody explained that Whitney had created separate social media accounts that she used specifically for family interactions, accounts where there was no trace of our relationship or any mention of having a boyfriend, while maintaining her regular accounts where our relationship was documented but family members weren't connected or allowed to see her true dating life. The level of premeditation and calculated deception was absolutely staggering, suggesting that Whitney had been planning this elaborate double life from the very beginning of our relationship rather than it being some recent development triggered by her increasingly bold flirtation phase at social events. Melody revealed that Whitney had even gone on actual dates with men she'd met through family connections, including her cousin Sarah's wealthy friend Marcus, who would be attending the birthday party and had apparently been the focus of Whitney's attention for several weeks. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus shared a name with the marketing consultant from Jake's Barbecue, making me wonder if Whitney had a specific type or if wealthy, successful men named Marcus were just drawn to her manipulative charm. According to Melody, Whitney had been describing these dates as casual encounters with family friends, carefully avoiding any mention of them being romantic in nature, while simultaneously telling the men involved that she was completely single and available for serious relationships. The web of lies was so complex and carefully constructed that it became clear Whitney was essentially living two completely separate lives, with different personas and different relationship statuses depending on which audience she was addressing at any given moment. Melody also shared that their mother had been expressing concern about Whitney's pattern of dating behavior, noting that she seemed to go through men quickly and always had some excuse for why relationships didn't work out, usually blaming the men for being inadequate or not meeting her supposedly high standards. What struck me most was Melody's revelation that Whitney had been using me as proof of her desirability when talking to potential dates, claiming that she had men competing for her attention and that she was carefully evaluating her options before settling down with someone truly worthy of her. I was essentially being used as a marketing tool to make her more attractive to other men while being kept completely separate from the family who might have questioned her behavior if they'd known the truth about our relationship. As Saturday approached, Melody and I finalized our plan for the birthday party, with her promising to introduce me loudly as Whitney's boyfriend of 8 months to ensure maximum impact when Whitney's carefully constructed lies came crashing down in front of her entire extended family. She'd already briefed me thoroughly on the guest list, warning me that Marcus would definitely be there and that Whitney had been particularly focused on impressing him during recent family gatherings, often mentioning casually that she was completely single and hoping to find someone stable and successful to build a future with. Melody also prepared me for the potential fallout, explaining that Whitney had a history of explosive reactions when confronted with her own behavior, dating back to high school incidents where she'd been caught in similar deceptive situations involving multiple boyfriends and elaborate lies. She warned me that Whitney would likely try to minimize our relationship or claim I was just a casual dating partner rather than admit to the serious, committed relationship we'd actually been building over 8 months together. The anticipation was building as I prepared for what would essentially be Whitney's very public unmasking in front of her family, knowing that her reaction would likely reveal even more about her true manipulative character than the systematic deception itself had already shown. Saturday evening arrived with perfect timing, and I spent extra care getting ready, choosing a sharp navy blazer that I knew made me look confident for what was essentially going to be the performance of a lifetime. I met Melody outside Elevation Wine Bar at exactly 7:30, and she immediately complimented my appearance while briefing me on final details and pointing out family members as they arrived. Through the large windows, I could see Whitney had positioned herself strategically near Marcus at a high-top table, wearing a stunning black dress I'd never seen before and displaying the same flirtatious body language I'd witnessed at Jake's Barbecue. She was leaning in close to him, touching his arm while laughing, clearly having spent considerable time preparing for this evening that she thought would advance her relationship with him while keeping me completely in the dark. Melody squeezed my arm reassuringly and reminded me to stay calm no matter how Whitney reacted, explaining that the family would be watching everything and that my composed behavior would speak volumes compared to whatever dramatic scene Whitney was likely to create. We walked through the entrance together, with Melody linking her arm through mine in a gesture that immediately caught the attention of several family members who seemed confused about why I was arriving with Melody instead of Whitney. The wine bar was elegantly decorated with warm lighting and filled with about 30 people, creating the perfect intimate setting for maximum impact when the truth finally came to light. Melody didn't waste any time with subtle approaches, instead walking directly into the center of the room and speaking loud enough for everyone to hear as she announced her gratitude for everyone attending. Then, with perfect dramatic timing, she turned toward me with a bright smile and declared loudly that she wanted everyone to meet her +1 for the evening, introducing me as Whitney's boyfriend of 8 months and expressing how excited she finally was to have me at a family celebration. The effect was instantaneous and devastating, with conversations stopping mid-sentence and every head in the room turning first toward me and then swiveling to locate Whitney, who had frozen completely with her hand still resting on Marcus's forearm like a deer caught in headlights. Her face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession, starting with confusion as she processed what she'd heard, shifting to recognition as she spotted me standing confidently next to Melody, then pure horror as the implications hit her, and finally settling into a pale mask of panic as she realized her carefully constructed deception had just been shattered in front of her entire extended family and the man she'd been actively pursuing for weeks. The silence that followed was deafening, stretching for what felt like an eternity as family members began processing the revelation and connecting dots about Whitney's previous claims of being single and actively dating. I could see relatives exchanging glances and confused whispers as they tried to reconcile what they just learned with the stories Whitney had been telling them for months about her relationship status. Marcus, who had been leaning in close to Whitney just moments before, immediately stepped back and removed his hand from her back where it had been resting, his expression shifting from interested attraction to uncomfortable confusion as he realized he'd unknowingly been participating in some kind of elaborate deception. Several family members I recognized from previous gatherings began walking over to greet me with warm smiles and congratulatory comments about finally seeing me at another family event, their genuine enthusiasm creating a stark contrast to Whitney's obvious distress and making it clear that they had no idea she'd been deliberately excluding me from celebrations. Whitney's Aunt Linda approached with a bright smile and mentioned how glad she was to see me again, adding that she'd been wondering why Whitney never brought me around anymore since I'd made such a positive impression during our previous meeting. The casual comment hit like another bombshell, revealing that family members had noticed my absence and had been questioning Whitney about my whereabouts, meaning her deception had required ongoing lies and excuses to maintain the facade that she was single. What happened next was like watching dominoes fall as one family member after another began sharing their own pieces of Whitney's deceptive puzzle, each revelation more damning than the last. Whitney's cousin Sarah was the first to speak up, addressing the growing crowd of confused relatives by explaining that she'd been trying to set Whitney up with eligible men from her social circle because Whitney had specifically asked her to keep an eye out for potential boyfriends who met her high standards for success and stability. She mentioned that just last month, Whitney had gone on what she described as a promising date with a lawyer from Sarah's office, claiming she was completely single and ready to settle down with the right person if he proved worthy of her time and attention. This revelation sent murmurs of shock and disapproval through the gathering as family members began realizing the scope of Whitney's deception and the fact that she'd been actively dating other men while maintaining a serious relationship with me for 8 months. Whitney's grandmother, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s who clearly didn't tolerate nonsense, stepped forward and demanded to know why Whitney had been telling the family she was unattached when she obviously had a serious boyfriend, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the room fall silent to listen. Before Whitney could formulate any response, her Uncle Robert chimed in with his own bombshell, revealing that Whitney had asked him to introduce her to his business partner's son during last month's family barbecue, specifically mentioning that she wanted to meet men who had their financial lives together. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present, especially given that I had a stable job and had been generous and supportive throughout our relationship, while she'd apparently been shopping around for someone with more money. Melody, feeling emboldened by the family's reaction, decided to confront Whitney directly about her systematic dishonesty, asking loudly why she'd been hiding a serious relationship while actively pursuing other men at family functions. She specifically mentioned the separate social media accounts Whitney maintained, the deliberate exclusion of me from family events despite our 8-month relationship, and the elaborate stories Whitney had concocted to explain my absence whenever family members asked about her dating life. The room erupted in a chorus of shocked exclamations and angry murmurs as relatives began connecting all the dots and realizing how extensively Whitney had been deceiving everyone, not just about her relationship status but about her fundamental character and integrity as a person they trusted and welcomed into their family celebrations. I remained calm and composed throughout the entire unfolding drama, simply standing next to Melody and allowing Whitney's own family members to expose her deceptive behavior without needing to say a single word in my defense, which only served to highlight the stark contrast between my dignified response and her increasingly desperate attempts to control the narrative. Whitney attempted to interrupt several times, trying to dismiss the accusations as misunderstandings, but each time she opened her mouth another family member would chime in with additional evidence of her duplicitous behavior that made her denials sound increasingly hollow. Her mother, who had been standing quietly near the bar looking increasingly mortified, finally stepped forward and asked me directly if I had any proof of our relationship, clearly wanting to get to the bottom of the situation. I calmly pulled out my phone and began showing photos and text messages that documented our entire relationship timeline, including romantic dinners, weekend trips, and daily conversations that clearly demonstrated we'd been in a serious, committed relationship for exactly 8 months. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, with timestamps that perfectly contradicted every lie Whitney had told her family about being single and actively seeking someone worthy of her standards. What made the situation even more damaging was that some of the photos I showed were taken during the exact same time periods when she'd supposedly been on dates with men her family had introduced her to, proving that she'd been deliberately scheduling these encounters while maintaining our relationship and lying to everyone involved. Marcus, who had been standing awkwardly to the side, finally spoke up to ask Whitney directly if what everyone was saying was true and if she'd been lying to him about being single. Whitney's face turned an even deeper shade of red as she realized that not only had her family discovered her deception, but the man she'd been actively pursuing was now questioning her honesty in front of everyone present. Whitney's attempts to salvage the situation became increasingly desperate and unhinged as she realized that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling beyond any hope of repair. She tried multiple times to pull me aside for a private conversation, grabbing my arm and insisting that we needed to talk away from her family so she could explain the misunderstanding, but I politely but firmly refused to be dismissed or managed like I had been so many times before. Her voice took on a shrill, panicked quality as she alternated between trying to charm her way out of the situation with nervous laughter and fake smiles, and becoming increasingly hostile toward both me and Melody for what she called ambushing her at a family celebration. She claimed that I was just a casual dating partner and that our relationship wasn't serious enough to warrant family introductions, desperately trying to minimize what we'd shared in front of relatives who had already seen overwhelming evidence to the contrary. When that approach failed to gain traction, Whitney switched tactics and began attacking my character, suggesting that I was obsessive and controlling for showing up uninvited to her sister's birthday party and trying to insert myself into family business that didn't concern me. The irony of her calling me controlling while she'd been systematically lying and manipulating everyone around her for months wasn't lost on anyone present, and her desperate accusations only served to make her look more unhinged. Her grandmother, clearly having heard enough nonsense, stepped forward and demanded direct answers, asking Whitney to explain exactly why she'd been telling different stories to different people about her relationship status. Instead of answering honestly, Whitney began making increasingly elaborate and contradictory excuses, claiming that she'd been protecting me from family pressure by keeping our relationship private, then immediately contradicting herself by saying that we weren't exclusive and she had every right to explore her options. Her mother looked absolutely mortified as Whitney's lies became more desperate and obvious, clearly recognizing that her daughter was digging herself into an even deeper hole with every word she spoke. The final straw came when Whitney's Uncle Robert asked her directly about the separate social media accounts and why she'd been actively asking family members to set her up with dates if she was in a committed relationship. Whitney completely lost her composure at this point, raising her voice and accusing everyone of ganging up on her unfairly, claiming that they were all jealous of her success and beauty and that's why they were trying to sabotage her happiness. She began pointing fingers at various family members, bringing up old grievances and personal attacks that had nothing to do with the current situation, making it clear that her mask had completely slipped and everyone was seeing her true manipulative personality for the first time. The outburst was so dramatic and inappropriate that several other patrons in the wine bar turned to stare at our group, clearly wondering what kind of family drama was unfolding at what should have been a pleasant birthday celebration. Marcus, who had been watching this entire meltdown with increasing discomfort, quietly excused himself and headed toward the exit without saying goodbye to Whitney, clearly wanting to distance himself from the chaos she was creating. Whitney noticed his departure and became even more unhinged, calling after him and trying to follow him toward the door while simultaneously screaming at her family members for ruining her chances with him and destroying what could have been a meaningful relationship. Melody, clearly fed up with her sister's dramatic performance and concerned about the scene she was creating in a public venue, firmly told Whitney that she needed to leave immediately and get herself together before she embarrassed the family any further. This triggered Whitney's final explosive outburst, where she turned on Melody specifically and accused her of orchestrating the entire confrontation out of jealousy and spite, claiming that Melody had always been jealous of her beauty and success. She screamed that everyone was against her and that she didn't need any of them because she could find people who actually appreciated her worth and understood her true value, before storming out of the wine bar while shouting that they would all regret treating her so unfairly when she found someone who truly deserved her and could provide the lifestyle she had always dreamed of having. In the aftermath of Whitney's dramatic departure, the wine bar fell into a stunned silence that lasted for several long moments as family members processed what they had just witnessed and tried to make sense of the complete character assassination they had seen unfold before their eyes. I remained standing quietly next to Melody, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over me as I realized that Whitney's true nature had been fully exposed and I would never again have to question whether I was overreacting to her behavior or being too suspicious of her motives and intentions. Her mother was the first to approach me, tears in her eyes as she apologized profusely for her daughter's behavior and expressed her mortification at the way Whitney had treated me and deceived the entire family for months. She explained that she had always suspected something was off about Whitney's stories regarding her dating life, but had never imagined the extent of her deception or the deliberate manipulation she had been employing to maintain her double life. One by one, other family members came forward to express their support for me and their disappointment in Whitney's actions, with many sharing that they had genuinely liked me during our previous encounters and had been confused and hurt by my sudden absence from family gatherings. Her Aunt Linda mentioned that she had specifically asked Whitney about me several times over the past few months, and Whitney had given vague, evasive answers about us taking a break or me being too busy with work to attend family events. Melody revealed additional details about Whitney's history of manipulative behavior in relationships, explaining that this pattern of deception and emotional manipulation dated back to high school when she had been caught juggling multiple boyfriends while telling each of them that he was her only serious relationship. She shared that the family had hoped Whitney had outgrown this behavior as she matured, but tonight's revelation made it clear that she had simply become more sophisticated in her methods of deception and compartmentalization rather than developing any genuine capacity for honesty or commitment. Whitney's grandmother, despite her advanced age and typically gentle demeanor, expressed her profound disappointment in her granddaughter's character and behavior, stating that she had raised her children and grandchildren to value honesty, integrity, and respect for others, and Whitney's actions represented a complete betrayal of those fundamental family values. The conversation continued for another hour as family members shared stories, offered support, and expressed their genuine relief that Whitney's deceptive behavior had finally been exposed before she could cause even more damage to relationships and family dynamics. As I processed the end of my relationship with Whitney, I realized that what I was feeling wasn't heartbreak or devastation, but rather a profound sense of relief and liberation from a situation that had been slowly eroding my self-confidence and making me question my own instincts. 6 months later, I found myself in a completely different place emotionally, having begun dating someone I met through Melody at a family barbecue where I was welcomed as a friend of the family rather than someone's secret boyfriend. Sarah was everything Whitney wasn't: honest, genuine, emotionally available, and genuinely interested in building something real together rather than maintaining elaborate deceptions while shopping for better options. Meanwhile, Whitney's reputation in our shared social circle had been permanently damaged by the public exposure of her deceptive behavior, with mutual friends expressing their shock and disappointment when they learned about her systematic dishonesty and manipulation tactics throughout our relationship. I heard through the grapevine that she had struggled to maintain any meaningful relationships after that night, as word of her behavior had spread through our interconnected social networks and made potential partners wary of her trustworthiness and emotional stability. The contrast between my life moving forward in a positive direction with someone who genuinely cared about me, and Whitney's apparent isolation and continued pattern of failed relationships, served as a powerful reminder that actions have consequences and that people who choose deception and manipulation over honesty and genuine connection ultimately end up exactly where they deserve to be. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Melody's birthday party had been the best thing that could have happened to me, not because I enjoyed seeing Whitney humiliated, but because it freed me from a relationship that was built on lies and allowed me to find someone who actually valued honesty, commitment, and the kind of genuine partnership I had always wanted to build with someone special.